everyone, welcome. I'm Alan Baxter and this is the Aussie Author Horror Show. So we're part of Inconceivable. Hopefully we're going to entertain you for about an hour or so. As I said, I'm Alan Baxter. I'm an author of horror and dark fantasy. A number of books to my name, Devouring Dark, a couple of collections, Surf Cold and Crow Shine, a bunch of other stuff. I wrote the Alex Kane series. You can find out all about it at alanbaxter.com.au, so find that out. We'll talk about all sorts of stuff during the course of this hour, but first of all, I'm going to go clockwise around my screen, which I hope is what's being recorded, and let these fine fellows introduce themselves. So first of all, Joseph Ashley Smith, tell us a bit about yourself.
I'm another British-Australian horror author, or author of dark fiction. Most recent book out is The Attic Tragedy, that's out now with Meerkat Press, and another book coming out from Meerkat Press next year, and I'm sure we'll end up talking about some of these things at some point. So
I'm sure we will. Thank you. Next around is Aaron Dries.
Hello, my name is Aaron Dries, author, artist, and filmmaker. I've got a couple of books out: House of Size, The Fallen Boys, the recently re-released A Place for Sinners, and Where the Dead Go to Die. And it's wonderful to be spending good quality time with you fine gents here in this weird spotlight situation that I have going on.
Well, we are honestly, we are a bunch of mates who are used to just kind of hanging out together and drinking in hotel bars, and now we're doing this weird sort of COVID-related Zoom thing, and one of us in a hotel room and others in offices and stuff. So yeah, we'll do our best to manage. Next around, Robert Hood.
Yes. Well,
introduce yourself.
Well, likewise, I write horror. I've been doing it for some time. Do write other things. A few novels out, and a hell of a lot of short stories that go back a long way. Ghosts are in there quite a bit. The last book of mine that came out was an 840-page book. That was all the ghost stories that I had ever had published. So yeah, it's called Peripheral Visions.
Peripheral Visions, exactly. It is an epic tome. It's a fantastic book. Yeah. Now, I'll start off by, because we are the Aussie Author Horror Panel, but two of us are actually only Australian more recently. So Joseph and myself are both British. I'm not sure how long. Joseph, you've been in Australia. It's been a while.
15 years.
15 years, yeah. So it's a bit more for me. So we're definitely very much or largely naturalised now, even if we sound funny. But then
there's not much natural about you.
No, that's true. That's true. There's nothing. Yeah, I'm not even going to argue with that. But for Joseph and I think we have this view of Australia a little bit from the outside because we grew up somewhere else and came to Australia, which I think is a unique perspective. But with Aaron and Rob, you guys are both born and bred, right? Aaron, is that true for you?
Yeah, I'm from the Hunter Valley, born and raised. Can't get rid of me, unfortunately. And now we're landlocked. Definitely can't get rid of me.
And I know you grew up, don't know about grew up, Rob, but you lived not far from me for a long time, but you've been around, haven't you, as far as Australia is concerned?
I was born and my early years were all in Rydalmere. You know where that is? The Ryde.
Where's that?
Near Ryde. Yes.
Northwest Sydney.
Yeah, West Sydney. Yeah.
And now you're a Canberran. And in fact, I'm the only one on this panel not currently a Canberran.
Yeah.
Canberran from we came here from Wollongong.
Yes, which isn't that's nearer to me.
Yeah. Yeah. And I came here from the Blue Mountains, so we're not all like hardened Canberrans.
No, that's right. But so when it comes to the Australian experience, this is what I was kind of driving at about where our sort of perspectives are. Every state in Australia is like a different country, but it really feels like we're very much sort of New South Wales and ACT largely experienced. I've travelled around a lot of Australia remember those days when we could move around the place? It was wild. So yeah, I've seen a lot of Australia, and I know that you guys have travelled a bit, but so it's impossible to really point out anything that is Australian because you compare Queensland to South Australia to West Australia to Tasmania. They're vastly different. They are like different countries. But is there anything that you guys think sort of encapsulates the Australian experience. And we'll sort of bring this into horror and stuff as we go. But what do you guys feel like is the Australian vibe? Do you want to start, Rob? What do you think?
Really hard to say. I mean, you two, as you said, you know, you're from the UK. But my parents came from the UK. And as I grew up, I was watching, you know, ABC rather than the main film.
So you're seeing a lot of British television anyway.
You know, what's typically Australian? I don't know. In people's eyes, it's the bad language, isn't it? All that sort of stuff, and the strange animals and that eat you if given half a chance, and all that sort of stuff. But you know, haven't really been much further than cities. It's always
been. Well, I mean, this is the thing, because country versus like rural versus urban Australian experience is vastly different, as well as the sort of difference between states. What do you think, Aaron? Do you have an angle on that?
Look, I think my perspective of Australia is limited just to my experience and my periphery. For me, Australia is like a hot, it's a hot, sweaty, stomach swelling Christmas day awkwardness in which you beeline from shady spot to avoid the sun, because I am so fair and the sun will destroy and obliterate me within 30 seconds. And it's continuously looking at media and books and film and television and the news and seeing like Australia is proper shrimp on the barbie and akubras and all these things that I just do not need to be cooking with shrimps. No shrimps from me. You'll get salmonella or something like that.
And they're prawns anyway. They're not shrimps. Yeah. They're prawns. They said shrimps for the American audience. It annoyed the hell out of me. Yeah.
And I guess
even in England, that bothered me.
That's right. It bleeds into horror fiction as well. But for me, Australia is a place of contrasts. It's either fire or it's flood. It is either freezing or it's hot. It's either I feel comfortable here or I feel really, really uncomfortable here. And I think that it's a place of extremes, and so it's probably not too surprising that for me personally, I tend to work within a bit more of an extreme genre. It seems to have kind of purged out. But like again, my understanding of what Australia is and what it is and how it kind of infuses what we do is kind of peripheral completely. You know, I'm a bit of a small town boy, and so my fiction tends to kind of veer that way as well. And but it's all messed up. Like, you know, I'm that guy who's still like, you know, I put my boots on, I shake them out of a morning so that spiders can all fall out. You know, I'm that person who, you know, when I'm getting to my car and I flip my visor down, I'm cautious of the fact that some huntsman might just jump on my face. Yeah. So for me, Australia is anxiety.
Well, I think we'll cover this a little bit when we start talking about Australian horror, because a sense of anxiety pervades all of it, I think. What about you, Joseph? Do you have a perception of it?
I don't know. I'm coming down a bit on the side of how you introduced it, Al, that there's so much variation, and it's so much variation in landscape that really kind of shapes the culture of all the different areas. You know, you get very different kinds of people in the very different areas. Like the people in the Blue Mountains are very different to the people on the Gold Coast, very different to people in Melbourne. It's really shaped by the landscape and by the kind of weather you have in that place. And I'd be kind of really hard pushed to say like there is one Australia. And I tend to think that whenever a nation tries to characterize itself, I mean, it's like Britain, to be honest, you know, what is British, you know? As soon as you try to kind of characterize it in that way, you end up with a caricature, which is the kind of shrimps on the barbie.
Well, this is where I suppose you get Crocodile Dundee and Steve Irwin.
Well, exactly. And that's kind of it's the outside perspective of Australia. But when you come here, it's like my experience of Australia, like as you sort of introduced it, you know, I come here as an expat, and I think I would have been less freaked out by Australia, or less freaked out if I'd moved to India or something, because the culture shock would be so intense. I'd know I was in a different place. but I kind of moved, and it's like all these people talk the same language as me, give or take, and we must have loads of things in common. And then you kind of dig down and go, oh my God, the Goodies was big here? What? Like,
yeah, and they watched it as a kids show instead of 8 o'clock at night on BBC Two.
Exactly, like that kind of stuff. It's like I've walked into a sort of Philip K. Dick parallel universe. A sort of, this weird. Is this America? Is it Britain? No, it's this. It's a weird kind of cultural melange place. Every Australian I want to shoot.
Absolutely. This is my perception of it as well. Is that for me, it was this weird amalgam of like the UK and the US that sort of was smudged together that made Australia. That I think there are certain unique aspects to it, which there has to be after this amount of time. Obviously, when I first came to Australia, I spent months backpacking just as a guitar and a backpack, and I was all through Southeast Asia for months and stuff like that. I came into Darwin, spent a little while in Darwin, and then headed with some friends down through the middle, and we stopped at I can't remember if it was Tennant Creek or Daly Water or somewhere like that. This shitbox down in the middle of nowhere in the Northern Territory. And I stopped in a roadhouse. They let us park our camper van out the back, and we were sitting in the bar, and a ute turned up, just all these people whooping and laughing, and there was like 6 people in the back and 3 people crammed in the front. They'd just driven for 2 hours cross country from the station, from the cattle station, to get to the pub, and they all had flannies on and sweaty stained akubras, and they were talking. They were the most stereotypical Australian country you could imagine. It was like, Jesus Christ, these people actually exist here. Like that is an aspect of Australia.
Yeah.
And then you get to Melbourne and there's goths sipping coffee, and there's, you go to Sydney and there's people in wine bars. And so, yeah, the idea that there's an Australian identity, I think is difficult to pin down. Like you said, the language, the drinking, larrikinism, all that sort of stuff. But so that leads us into then what makes Australian horror. I know one of the things we talked about before we did the panel was we were going to come up with examples each, which is probably the better way to do it, because trying to pin down what would make Australian horror is hard to do. But to use an example of Australian horror and talk about why it's so Australian, then yeah, that could be a little bit different. So should we segue clumsily into that and talk about some of the Australian horror that we
sounds good
that we draw? Why don't you start, Joseph? Why don't you kick off as Rob started last time? What did you pick?
Well, I picked 2 things, kind of because it's hard to pick a thing that's like, this is Australia.
Yes, tough.
My first pick is very much that kind of Akubra romanticized Australian vision. And it's Wolf Creek. It's a 2005 film by Greg McLean. And I mean, I'm sure everybody knows and has seen Wolf Creek. It's almost no point in describing what's Australian about it, because it's almost like the joke of Australia. Like, it even has this kind of knowing nod to Crocodile Dundee in it. It has the "that's not a knife" gag put to horrendous effect. But it's a weird movie, or it's somehow quintessentially the idea of Australia, because it combines this. It's almost like a tourist video. Like half of the shots are just these sort of beautiful kind of wilderness landscapes, and there's some red kangaroos and
the crater rim where they go to visit. Amazing. You wouldn't find that in other countries.
It's literally like a tourist video, and then it's intercut with sort of hardcore torture porn. So I find it really strange. What's interesting about it too is that 2 out of 3 of the protagonists are British. The whole film it's an outsider's view of Australia, and it's almost the kind of, it is that stereotype, the Akubra wearing. It's where people say fair dinkum without irony. And it just happens that the guy that says fair dinkum without irony is going to, stick a kind of knife in your spine. Yeah.
But talking about the sort of weird connections with Australia as well, like the fact that John Jarratt, who played the killer, was famous in Australia as a presenter on a gardening show. Like, even in my time in Australia, I knew John Jarratt as the guy that was on. It wasn't Gardening Australia, but it was one of those types of shows, and he would talk about gardening, and that next thing he's playing the guy in Wolf Creek, and so it's like that for me was a fantastic juxtaposition. Anyway, I love weirdness like that. So look at that guy. I knew there was something weird about that guy.
Yeah. So so that you have, that's the one extreme, like that's that kind of the sort of Steve Irwin Australia, you know, it's like the American view of Australia, or the outsider's view. And like my other pick is a brilliant novel by Karen Warren called Slights. I think it was Karen's first novel. And that it's incredibly Australian, but it's such a different kind. It's like a personal Australia, you know, where Wolf Creek is like the public service announcement view of Australia. Slights is this incredibly internal, very, very personal. It's all built up of these kind of tiny details and inflections of voice that any Australian, or sort of any suburban Australian, would completely recognise. But to an outside, you know, an American or a British person reading it wouldn't pick it up and go, "God, this is so Australian," because the references are they're all personal. You know, it's all about you know, tinned asparagus and twisties and golden syrup dumplings and the smell of jasmine, you know, like all of those things that are incredibly evocative of a certain kind of Australia, but that you know, there's not enough Cooper in sight.
It's almost the sort of thing you don't really notice. If you are Australian or you have experience of it, you recognise it. If you don't, you're just like, well, this is somewhere different.
Yeah, exactly.
You wouldn't potentially pin exactly where. But yeah, I mean, Karen's writing and her attention to detail is just like awe-inspiring sometimes. So
it's a very different kind of horror too. You know, it's a quieter horror, and it's a sort of horror that has that real slow build and it kind of drags you along with it and makes you question the kind of person that you are for enjoying it.
Yes, it's got that that Jack Ketchum vibe as well about it, where you read it and you really enjoy it, and you kind of are a bit concerned that you enjoy it.
Yeah, exactly.
Karen's very, she's an under your skin writer, isn't she? Like that.
Yeah. So those are my poles, the sort of two poles of Australian horror.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, they're good benchmarks to set. So if that was a dart in either side of the board, Aaron, where do you throw yours for a bullseye?
Sorry, my turn?
Yeah, go on.
Sorry, you just cut out for a second. All right, I picked, I'll do my book first, which I actually brought it with me. So as we alluded to before, I'm actually in a hotel room, and
because you're on the run, yeah, is that right? You're currently on the lam.
I'm on the lam. I'm on the glam, because if I'm on the run from the law, I still will, you know, kind of go 3-star hotel and more at least. But what I have here is a book that for me was kind of like a fundamental text growing up. This copy actually belonged to my grandfather, and I nicked it off his shelf when I was really young, and I read it, and I gave it back to him, and he's like, "You are too young to read this." And I would have been like 11 or 11 and a half or something at the time. It's a book called Fortress by Gabriel Lord. Okay, this cover, and I'll hold it up to the camera, gave me nightmares, let alone the content, if you can see. That is a school window with a masked gunman peering into the school class.
Okay.
It's written by Gabriel Lord. It was her first book. She's subsequently gone on to have a career fundamentally within the thriller, but primarily crime space. But this, I guess they would call it a thriller, but no, this is a full-on horror novel. It's about a young teacher who flees Sydney and takes a posting basically 300 kilometers basically into the middle of nowhere. And she's there, she's thinking, what the hell am I doing with my life? I'm here and I'm in charge of like 11 children, and that's the total of the entire school at this spit and you'll miss it little town. But then these blackmailers in animal masks with guns come up and hold and kidnap the entire school, all 11 kids or so, and the school teacher, and take them into the mines where they're holding them hostage for blackmail for about $1 million or something like that. And what this school teacher does is that she finally has the necessity to kind of put some of her lived experience into action, considering the stuff that she's gone through in the past, where she has to essentially turn these 11-year-olds into warriors who are going to be making spears. And so it kind of it's like the scouts go to hell and they have to fortify these mines and fight their way out. And it's this teacher teaching like little kids how to use guns and making bow and arrows and stabbing people. It is horrific. The thing that I love about
Scouts,
this is...
sorry, I'm just going to stop you there because Scouts go to hell. I mean, that's brilliant. That's enough. I haven't read this book, but I am going to now because Scouts go to hell.
Really good. It was made into quite a nifty little film that was written by Everett DeRoche, who did the adaptation, who I'll get to soon.
Okay.
So this is a really terrific, very short, brutal read, primarily set in the daylight, which I really loved about it. That was something that to me that was kind of very, very different from anything else that I'd read or seen. And it kind of it also has a frankness to it in its language, which I think that was very different from anything that I'd read. And it had that bush versus city vibe going on about the displacement that happens when you're not quite sure where you belong, and to some degree, it's a bit of an immigration metaphor. And there's something about it that is quintessentially Australian, and I love it. And it's also so that's my book recommendation.
It's on my list now.
Fortress by Gabriel Lord. The film I obviously don't have with me is a movie made in 1978 by a director named Colin Eggleston, and it's called Long Weekend. Have any of you guys seen Long Weekend, just out of curiosity?
No, we started talking about it.
Yeah, all right. Yeah. So it's about a bickering husband and wife who are obviously at the very tethered, like the last remnants of their marriage. And they are getting out of Melbourne for a long weekend. They go up into the mountains, to the beaches. And whilst they're there, their relationship gets more and more toxic. And essentially, Mother Nature, toxicity, it looks like, we're going to actually mess you up. And so Mother Nature basically escalates to match their emotional moods. There's this like decomposing dugong, right, on the side of the beach that is getting closer and closer to their campsite. It's a little bit like the angels in Doctor Who. You turn around and it's a dead, busted open dugong. Is like a bit closer. They're in the middle of the camping site and they're fighting, and they'll get swooped by eagles. They will bring out food to cook, and it will grow mold in no times. Their moods fluctuate, and you realize that there's a lot of trauma there in their relationship, and it will bring in the tide before it should. So it's a completely elemental story in which the characters' motivation, stories, and progress and arc is echoed by Mother Nature. And so it kind of portrays Australia as a place, that is scary, but also that there's a bit of a handshake deal in it. Like, I think it's kind of easy to go, in Australia, everything will kill you, right? We all kind of propagate that myth, but realistically, we kind of have a copacetic relationship to it. And by us bringing that toxicity into the bush, it kind of is meeting us halfway. And it touches on bushfires, everything. It's a incredibly frightening, suspenseful, eerie kind of Peter Weir meets pulp, craziness. And I cannot recommend it enough. It was remade a couple of years ago with Claudia Carvin and directed by Jamie Blanks, who made Valentine, and it was a very different film, but still quite nifty. So it's Long Weekend, 1978. You can pretty much find it streaming anywhere. I think it's on Shudder here in Australia. It's a really fascinating film made by a director who only made a couple of films. The main actor is the performances are brilliant, and it's got that bush versus city tension, and it's about threat and respecting Mother Nature, and it's brilliant.
Dig it. I like the sound of it for sure. It's yes, I think both of those are going to the top of my relative lists. Joseph's I was already on top of. Both read those, no problem. But you hit me with two fresh ones there, so that's good. What about you, Rob? What did you have?
Well, I went for what is almost a giant monster movie. It came from a period, the 70s and 80s, when Australian cinema, popular cinema, was trying to give itself reality. They wanted to, it had been dominated our cinemas have been dominated by American films and British films, and there was a movement amongst directors and various people to use horror and thrillers, basically, populist films. And one of them was called Razorback, because it has this huge razorback pig in it that goes crazy and does what they usually do, which is create a lot of mayhem and death. It's got some fabulous scenes in it. I'll get to that in a minute. They called this movement
Ozploitation.
What you just said.
Yeah.
But it generally includes in it things like Mad Max, Patrick, which was a really good film, Turkey Shoot, Dead End Drive-In, and of course, as has been mentioned, Long Weekend. In here, the razorbacks normally are large, I believe. I've never actually met one, but they're large and bulky and have short legs and a head that takes up, I'm told, about a third of their whole body length. Large fangs that sprout out from the side of the mouth. The razorback has, someone says in the film, the razorback has two states of being: dangerous and dead.
I mean, that's a movie tagline right there, isn't it? Really? That's all you need. That's all you need to know.
That's right. Anyway, it is a really good film. It was made by what's his name? Russell Mulcahy. Yes.
I can never pronounce his name either, Rob. His first film, I think, was Highlander, which was all around the place.
Oh.
Anyway, this one they made for, I think it was about $2 million. They made it, but $1 million of that went to the animatronic creation of the actual razorback itself, which wasn't. I mean, it didn't actually move all that much. It had to be moved, but it works remarkably well, mainly because he filmed it in such a way that it could. It didn't allow you to look at it for too long. You didn't always see it all together. So there's that whole rush. And it had some great. One of my favourite scenes is this guy's sitting in his room watching TV, and the razorback.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
and it just smashes through the house and drags most of the house with it as it keeps running. And this guy is left there in the open, just looking at, what happens.
He's sitting in his chair and even the TV is disappearing into the distance.
That's right. The TV is disappearing into the distance.
Yeah.
Anyway, hilarious. But the interesting thing about it too is, of course, the monster is the main danger here. But there's also these what's called redneck crazy people that play an important part as well. They're two guys that own the local, not doing very well, pet food factory. And they're called Dicko and Benny Baker, two brothers. And they're just as sort of more frightening than the razorback.
Yes, exactly. This is what I was gonna say. It's a film about a razorback, but the scariest thing is not the pig.
Right, right. So the whole feral nature of the outback is. Someone said this. I think it might have been me in an article I wrote. Said razorback exists in a version of outback Australia that is as feral, depraved, and brutal as the monster. So I guess this is.
Can we just point out that Rob has reached a point in his career where he can quote himself in articles? I'm impressed.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think from memory, it was a while since I watched it, but I think one of the main characters was American, weren't they? Yeah.
Well, I watched it relatively recently because everybody I knew when I wrote The Roo, I knew I was drawing heavily on that when I'd seen it before, and I deliberately didn't watch it again when I wrote the review. But then when I finished that, I was very keen to watch it again, because I was like, how much of that was in my subconscious? And so, you know, a month or two after I finished writing the review, I watched it again.
Yeah.
And it was a trip, man, honestly. The
It gets
first...
sort of, in certain places, it gets rather fantastical. I mean, it's like another world. Almost.
Well, the first time I saw it, I was still English. So before I come to Australia, so me and my friends, we used to go down the pub, we'd go drinking, the pubs would close at 11 o'clock, we'd all pile back to my flat in Woking, and we would watch videos. We would go to the video store before we went to the pub and get a tape. We'd rent a tape, we'd leave it in the flat, we'd go down the pub and drink, we'd come back and watch the video. And so much, horror especially, but so much stuff I saw that way. And that's how I saw Razorback, in a cold flat in Woking, very English, with a bunch of English people. And we sat there and watched this movie, and we're like, what the f have we just seen? The way it was shot, with the landscape, with the lighting, the crazy way that he used like heavy, bright spotlights behind trees, so there'd be massive light coming out. You couldn't see the light, you just see the spread of it, and then this pig on a trolley fanging past. And the experience is... And when I watched it again recently, this is why I bring it up, when I watched it again recently, that vibe that we got, being completely bemused by it in England, even after 25 years in Australia and a lot of experience with the outback and everything else, I still triggered that same response in me. These people were just caricatures, larger than life. The landscape was everything.
Yeah. And it kills even some of the people you think are major nice.
Yeah, no one is safe.
You get completely torn to pieces. Anyway, I recommend it to people. There's some good versions of it now. The first time I saw it was on a bad, videotape.
Yeah.
With it cut down and all that sort of thing.
It's probably a remastered director's cut by now, isn't there?
But practically, yeah. I have one. And it's very good. Yeah. Lots of interesting extras along with it, so I've managed to track it down. It's worth it. The book I was going to talk about, Alan has already mentioned, because I just read The Rue. And of course you mentioned yourself that obviously there was not a connection exactly, but you recognise the connection after you started to write it.
Yeah.
And it is. It's The Rue has more people that you actually... I mean, I don't think you have the extremes of the two brothers.
No, I was surprised at just how horrible the people were when I rewatched Razorback, because I didn't remember as much until I saw it again more recently, and just like, they are just awful. But yeah.
So yours are much more like ordinary people than others, but it still has that flavour of the dangerous outback. Only in this case it's a giant kangaroo.
Yes, exactly. You just need an oversized thing that's feral and very deadly. It can be a kangaroo or a pig, it doesn't really matter. Which is ironic, really, given that many things in Australia that can kill you and will kill you and everything else. But probably, the most famous one turns out to be a giant pig. And then I write a book about a kangaroo, and it's like, well, maybe that's what we're looking for, trying to mythologize things that actually aren't deadly.
Yeah. Anyway, I recommend to people seeing the movie.
Yeah.
Razorback, and reading Alan's book.
Well, thank you. I recommend that too. Thank you. I was very much drawing, when I wrote that, I was very much drawing on Ozploitation. Because, as I said, when I was growing up, I was grown by that point, living in a flat with, and working and whatever else, when I saw films like Razorback, and that's when I first saw Waking Fright. That's when I first saw Mad Max and things like this. And so it was amazing to me that sort of Australia, it does exist. Like, most of us live in the cities. Like, the vast majority of the population live in some form of urban environment, cities or suburbs or whatever. But there is a huge population of Australia that lives in very rural places. There's a huge population that lives in very much outback places, and that's almost it is almost a fantasy setting when you start transferring it into horror films like Razorback, because it becomes something far. It becomes, the landscape, the country itself becomes a character of itself almost.
That's right.
And that's very much what I was drawing on when I was writing The Room, is I want to pull that up, all that, when I remember watching those films and reading those things when I was in my teens and 20s and just being mystified. To come here and discover it still exists was mind-blowing and awesome, and it's like, well, that's what I want to draw on. Which actually, I'll take that. That actually segues quite well into the film I was going to talk about, because I wanted to talk about Lake Mungo. Now, as I was saying to you guys before we started recording, bizarrely, I'd never heard of this film before until I was talking to Paul Tremblay, who's an American, and it's one of his favourite films. He was talking about it being a good influence when he was writing Disappearance at Devil's Rock and stuff like that. And he draws on a lot of those things. So I went and tracked it. So I ended up talking to an American author in America about this amazing Australian film. Well, I don't know. So I came back and tracked it down. And the thing that strikes me about it, the reason I picked it, is that it's incredibly Australian when you watch it. It's a found footage film. It's like a mockumentary almost. So it's incredibly well done, because it's not just found footage, and it's not just mockumentary. They kind of get some genuine, like, dramatized scenes that they kind of slip in almost under the radar. You kind of almost don't really notice that, okay, we need to tell this bit of the story, so there's no reason this would be on the kids' video camera or anything else, but they just drop that bit in, so you get that little bit of sort of narrative that goes on. But the thing that I loved about it was the fact that it was so very Australian to look at, but not particularly Australian in terms of story. And I really liked that it was a story that could have been anywhere. Like, you could easily have set this whole drowning in the lake. I won't say too much about it to spoil it for people, but the thing that the girl confronts, and the girl drowns in the lake right at the start, that's not giving anything away. And subsequently the haunting and the seeing of ghosts around the house. All of that could have been set anywhere. You could have done that very easily in the countryside in England. You could have done it in the Midwest or the Pacific Northwest of America. You could do it anywhere. But the fact that it was done in these Australian suburbs is brilliant, because the story is universal and the setting is kind of irrelevant unless you choose to pay attention to it. It's just that people talk with a funny accent, I would imagine. Like, if you're watching in America or the UK or whatever, you very easy to forget in this Australian film until you suddenly see these landscapes like around the lake, and so it's this dry landscape, and they call it a lake, but it's like a dam on a sheep property out in the middle of nowhere with all these sort of fallen bleached trees and stuff lying around. It's just this fantastic landscape. And for me, when it comes to landscape as character in horror, for the same reason Wolf Creek works like it does, because of where it is miles from anywhere, and the same reason that Razorback works, because it's in this weird industrial pet food factory outback town kind of thing. That I love that about Australian horror, is that way that landscape and that the country itself becomes such an integral part of the setting. You could take the story and set it somewhere else and you still have a good horror story. You take that story and you put it here and you have a like quintessentially Australian horror story, which is also why I'll talk quickly about the book. The book I picked is not, it wouldn't be considered a horror novel, it would be considered a thriller. It's The Broken Shore by Peter Temple. But when I was thinking about it, I mean, it is a horror story to a degree, because it's a murder, it's a killing, there's robbery, there's a copper trying to figure stuff out, there's weird shit going on. So it's more than just a straight up thriller. But it also plays a lot with it's set down in Victoria, and it plays a lot with the difficulty between the city and the country, the indigenous population and the rural population and stuff like that. And it's another one of those, when I started thinking about this, the nature of Australian horror, what makes it Australian, is that, again, it's a thriller that could have been set almost anywhere, assuming you had the sort of have and have-nots, like the colonial and the indigenous population, which is, unfortunately, pretty endemic all over the place. You can still take that story and set it anywhere, but the fact that this one is set in Melbourne and rural outskirts, a couple of hours from Melbourne, makes it absolutely the story that it is. And it's a brilliant thriller. It's so well written. And so that's what started me thinking about what is it that makes Australian horror. And I think a lot of it is based in that it's the country, it's the land, more than anything else. Because, like you said, Joseph, we're as a population with this weird sort of amalgam of British and American sort of rubbed together until something extra came out, and that's Australian. And you can pick threads of what is Australian, but it's not that different to British or American.
Yeah.
So I feel like it's that landscape and that connection between the bush and the city, the outback and the bush, the rural and the urban. It's that there's most definitely a very Australian vibe to that, which is why I enjoyed writing the Roo so much and drawing on that exploitation stuff. And I think probably why it's been as popular as it has, because honestly, it was a gag, and it's just been so popular. And I think that's partly why I wish all my books sold as well as the Roo did. But and that's why I've embraced it, and I'm very much working on Australian stories now. But let's use that to segue then to what we're writing about and what we're drawing on. So we've talked about the Roo, but let's go round. Joseph, what's your Australian story? What have you written?
Just before we move on, I really want to pick up on what you're saying about Lake Mungo and about setting, because I was really thinking about that, about Wolf Creek as well. Like, you asked us the question, what makes Australian horror? What's unique about it? And the more I thought about it, the more it's like, well, kind of nothing. Like in terms of the horror,
right?
Say you take Wolf Creek just as any example, and you think, oh, that's an incredibly Australian movie, but you could set that literally anywhere where there's some kind of wilderness, like anywhere at all, and all of the horror elements would be the same, but the kind of the vibe of it entirely comes from that outback setting, and from the culture that kind of sprouts there like a fungus, fermenting in that kind of in its own juices, the kind of weird cultures you get there. I can't remember what I was going to say next, but anyway, so pulling it back, you were saying, what is Australian about? How do we write Australian? What was your question?
Exactly that. Basically, when we're sort of drilling down, trying to figure out, and I agree with you. We should stop punching below our weight and set good stories in Australia, because we have great stories to tell, and this is a great setting to put them in. And there's no reason we should go, but it's Australian. It should be American. It should be it should be Australian. This is a fantastic place to set stories.
There's this conceit that I keep hearing, people wanting to get published saying, writing stories set in America because that's the only way to get it published. And it's like, why don't you write a brilliant story about the place that and look around you and find what's kind of extraordinary and weird in the place where you are.
And a good story is a good story regardless. So the fact that we said it here, just all it does is make it more interesting.
Exactly. But so for me, like how I write Australian, I mean, being an expat, it's kind of weird. I always feel like I'm being a bit deceitful.
I know, I hear you.
For me, there are details about Australia that I really zoom in on because I find them so weird, because they're alien to me. And those little things kind of really stand out. And I like to tell kind of what you're talking about with Lake Mungo, stories that could be, broadly, they could be anywhere, but then there's just weird details that could only exist in Australia. And exactly as you say, it's always born out of the setting. And I mean, just thinking of a number of examples. I mean, like the Attic Tragedy, for example, that's set in the Blue Mountains, in a kind of amalgam of about 4 different Blue Mountains towns. But the entire mood of the piece and the just the kind of characters, the kind of people that are there, are completely born of that landscape and the sort of weird weather patterns that you get there, and the sort of particular kind of desolation, a mix between extraordinary beauty and just abandonment, like being kind of that far, you're still kind of close to civilization, but far enough away from it to start feeling isolated. So it's definitely a kind of setting thing for me, and picking up on details. I I mean, kind of like the things that I was saying in Karen's book. You know, it's it's about twisties, and it's about the kind of the I've got this vision. There's a scene in the Attic Tragedy that's set, like, it's probably the most intimate scene in the book, between these two girls, but it's set with them lying on top of a kind of concrete bunker, basically at the edge of a lake. You know, the sort of the storm drain thing, and that was just a feature, just a thing, a slight ugly thing that I had seen on walks, like walking around near where I lived. And just that weird juxtaposition of this incredibly ugly, very man-made, super functional thing in this kind of beautiful, kind of desolate space.
Well, an incredibly ugly man-made thing in a beautiful, desolate space. It's pretty good summation of Australia itself when you talk about the colonial influence. Well, like when the Europeans got here, basically we built a lot of ugly shit in a beautiful place.
But that is the sort of. I mean, again, when I was thinking about it, like, what is Australian horror? What is there anything uniquely Australian? You know, what is perhaps not uniquely Australian, but certainly characteristic. Is that kind of struggle of, it's like sort of struggling to be civilized against a completely uncivil landscape that doesn't give a fuck about you and will kill you without. Yeah, that, and again, you know, I don't want to keep coming back to Wolf Creek because I actually don't like it very much as a film. It characterizes that really well, in that you have, you know, what's like the John Jarratt character is the icing on the cake. It's actually the landscape that's the frightening thing.
The literal geography will kill you.
Well, exactly.
You're not prepared for it, like within a few days.
The one moment for me of like true horror in that, like that's not just like you know, I snapped her spine with a knife kind of grew, is the point where they come down from the crater and they've just had this kind of great time, and the two of the protagonists have just kind of copped off at the top of a crater, and it's like, oh, this is just great. And they get back, and then it's just like clunk 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 clunk. The car won't start, and you've just been looking at these kind of vistas of vast, infinite nothing. They've been driving for about 10 minutes of the movie has just been kind of them driving through nothing.
Yeah.
And that you get this, I mean, talking about it, I'm getting goosebumps and a sort of sinking feeling, because you're just like, we're fucked. You know, even without a psycho killer, you're fucked. What can you do? Absolutely nothing. It's that total helplessness in the face of a vast, uncaring universe, you know.
Yeah, we when I was traveling through the outback, we picked up a guy who was walking along rolling a flat wheel, like a flat tire on the wheel, and it turned, long story short, because we don't have time for it now, but basically there were two of them in the car. They didn't have a spare, they got a flat, and one guy was staying at the car and the other guy was walking along wheeling. We'd been driving for 3 hours from the nearest town, and we were like, you're gonna die, your mate is gonna die. So we ended up picking him up and his wheel, driving him back to town 3 hours, getting his puncture repaired, insisting that he buy a spare, and then driving what was nearly 4 hours back to his friend, by which time it was dark and his friend was sitting in the car dehydrated and everything else. This was all in the space of basically 14-hour period.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, this guy he'd only got a quarter of the way back, and he was planning to walk all the way, and then what? Try and hitch a lift with a the landscape will kill you. You can't not respect the size and emptiness of large parts of Australia. Aaron, what about you? I know what I think about as soon as I think about your writing and what's Australian. I know which book I think about, but
I have no idea what you would be talking about or alluding to. But look, maybe I do. I grew up in a town where the sign coming into town read, "Welcome to Branxton. We have 2 cemeteries and no hospitals. Drive carefully." Drive carefully. So, and it was the type of place where it didn't matter which road you took out of town. There were like little memorial wreaths on the side of the road where people had crashed their cars.
Yeah.
And you went to school, you went to the pool, and you went to the video store, and you went home, and you ate your meat and your 2 veg, and you took put on the television and you watch The Simpsons at 6 o'clock, and wedged between the commercial breaks were these insanely violent road awareness campaigns,
Yes.
like head-on collisions, and we're talking. It's like they don't show these type of advertisements on like free-to-air television the way they used to anymore.
Yeah.
But it was, imagine like Greg McLean, who made Wolf Creek, does Drive Safely Awareness Week. It's like babies shooting through windshields, like old
baby capsules coming loose off the seat and stuff. Yeah.
Absolutely. So this is Australia to me. This is the country that I grew up in. This the world in which, and I was just this kind of insecure, like the world is out to get me kid, trying to navigate my way through it. And it's not surprising to think that it was like with my first novel that I wrote, which is called House of Size, that it kind of very, very much is about this environment and about someone who's not all that dissimilar from me, trying to navigate and survive it, and being absolutely cuckolded by circumstance and the environment, and about what's expected of this person. The book is about a bus driver who kidnaps all of her passengers and takes them home to her kind of rural estate to become her new family. And they're stuck on this bus with the temperatures rising, and they essentially these characters have to run a gauntlet of these typical Australian challenges, basically, in a pursuit of survival and to seek some sort of identity, whittling down all to whatever's honest at the end of it. That's the whole kind of the vortex and the drive of it. And that a lot of that comes as well from looping back to what we were talking about before, which is Ausploitation, and stuff that Rob was talking about. Like Long Weekend is Ausploitation, and I think it's not just like the killer ruse, and it's the killer Razorbacks running through and smashing up houses. It was Mad Max. It was Vanity Point. It was all of these movies that were about the road and about cars and about heat, like coming up off the tarmac, and these long road games. All these movies which were about these long stretches of abandoned bitumen that would take you from one rural part of Australia to the middle of nowhere, and all the bad things that can happen on the route. And so for me, I have no choice but to write that stuff because that's all I know. And so
for me, Outback Australia is driving along a road where the road disappears into mirrored haze, and like there's the bush and the red sand on either side, and you can see that goes a lot further, but the road doesn't go as far as the bush because the road just turns into this silver kind of haze ahead of you. It just goes on forever because it's that hot, and that for me, that's just I've spent hours and hours just sitting there pointing at, and if you look at that glassy mirrored haze on the road, you just start to zone. You have to look around and see the stuff that is real because it's just endless. Yeah. But yes, House of Size, exactly. That's when I say, as soon as I think about you and Australian fiction, that's like that book, no question. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate that. Look, all I'll say is that I am not afraid to lean into setting. For me, setting is as fundamental and important as anything else. And to be really honest, I'm at a point in my life where I'm not interested in reading fiction that doesn't have a sense of place. Yeah. For me, it's one of the wonderful things about this genre and why I'm drawn to it as a writer and a reader. It's because I love it. You give me the town, give me the house, and then give me the people inside it, and then give me the monster inside the closet. Because without it, the whole deck of cards tends to fall and doesn't ring true to me. So that's how I work.
Yeah, I agree. I agree completely. What about you, Rob? I mean, I've read a lot of your stories that are very Australian, even some set in Wollongong, which is very local to me. So, yeah. So, where's your Australian writing for?
I think I mainly write about various Australian places because I've been there and I can see them, and so it actually makes it easier to write about them.
Yeah.
Mind you, there's one thing you haven't mentioned, that a lot of people associate Australia with certain slang terms, which you use very well in The Roo.
I enjoyed the hell out of that, yeah.
But, people expect that to be in it. And generally, I don't use it very much.
Well, it's an interesting thing because in Ozploitation, it's very much ramped up. It's like emphasizing your accent to sound as ochre and bogan as you can. And absolutely with the row, I just lean hard into that. But yeah, I find that too with a lot of the stuff that I write in Australian settings. It's like, well, there's no. I know that in the small detail there's Australian influence in that, but you don't necessarily feel it so much. I often find that in edits I might add a little additional Australian vibe to stuff that is set in Australia, just to go, by the way, this is set in Australia, because a lot of my stuff isn't, but a lot more of it these days especially is. So yeah, I tend to go back and almost add it in a little bit to emphasize the twang and the accent. Yeah.
Well, I was writing some stories for Exotic Gothic, you know, that series.
Yes, yes.
Neil Olsen. And the first one I wrote was called Punya, right? So it's based on an Aboriginal thing, and it's around Uluru and all that sort of stuff. And I mainly did it because I'd been there. I won a prize actually that flew myself and my wife at the time up to that place. And so when he asked for a story, that came to mind.
Yeah.
So it's ghosts around there and all sorts of things, and Kulkunya, it comes into it and all that. But I had to do a lot of research, and I was a bit worried about it because that's such an important place for the Aboriginals and all that. But luckily, I worked in the university that had a lot of Aboriginal people working there, so I put most of it past them to make sure it was accurate and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, that's the right thing to do, sure, yeah.
Yeah, but the thing that Donnell really liked about it, or one of the things, resulted in the language aspect. And so for a subsequent book that he brought out, I wrote another story for it that he made a whole lot of comments about the slang that wasn't in it.
What did you put more in?
I had to, I said, look, I can put some in, but it won't be those ones because no one says that.
Yeah, not around here.
There was a lot of that sort of stuff. So there's a worldwide view of that comes from, I guess, some of the films that have been brought out that exaggerate that aspect of it.
Well, especially with the Crocodile Dundee and the Steve Irwin and stuff, the things most people are aware of are things that ramp it up to a caricature degree. So, yeah.
But that's what amused me then, is he got to the stage where he was sending stories that Americans had written that had Australians in it, so that I could Australian it up for them.
Yeah.
So that was a bit weird. But I find I write about Australian places a lot. I didn't think so. When I started to go through my stories in preparation for this, to see how many I actually had. And I didn't think there was many, but there ended up being heaps of them.
Yeah.
And I hadn't even realised it because it's just what you know, and that's where it comes out. The one I think I like best, it's not outback at all, was Time and Tide, which was in the book Cthulhu Deep Down Under. And it was set in Mollymook on the coast and all that.
Yeah, right.
And I basically destroyed the place.
But don't do that. Mollymook's quite nice.
Yeah, I know.
If you're going to destroy somewhere, destroy Ulladulla or something. Huh?
And it was an interesting thing to write. And
get hate mail from Ulladulla now.
Yeah.
One of the novels I've been writing, just finished it, that had been around earlier, is basically set in Sydney and Wollongong, mostly Wollongong, in fact. And it's a crime horror thing. And a certain person that I won't name, that I had shown it to, they gave it back to me and said, no, that this is no good. that sort of stuff would never happen in Wollongong. And
I think they need a better idea of Wollongong.
You don't know much about Wollongong,
Yeah.
do you? And
Yeah.
I actually told the story to a friend of mine that worked in the university, and he was in the history department, and his specialisation, he was actually putting a book together on the criminal history of Wollongong. It goes right back before it was barely there, where you had gangland stuff going on, you know. Now, we didn't, when we were living there, we didn't see much of that sort of thing, but it was there.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, Wollongong's a gritty city. It's a bit, yeah, it doesn't surprise me. Well, listen, we are a bit running out of time on this front here. So I was going to say I could carry on chatting to you guys for hours. I mean, that is normally what we do. But we're going to have to wind this up, or we'll get in trouble with the Inconceivable people for going over our allotted time.
They can edit the bits out.
Yes, I mean, we don't want them to edit anything, though. This is all gold. Every minute of this has been just nothing but pure gold. So I think we need to wrap it up because we are running on to our hour now. So why don't we just go around? Two things I want from each of you: what it is that you're working on, especially if it's Australian, and where people can find. We've all got the Evently store. I should mention this about the convention with Inconceivable. There's a marketplace. There's heaps of stuff in the marketplace. You can go and see all the different types of creators that are there. From our point of view, you can find signed books. You can buy signed paperbacks from us and stuff like that. And you should check out all the amazing creators and vendors that are there. But let's just go around. Tell me what you're working on and where people can find you outside of the convention. So where's the best place to find you online? So you start, Rob. We'll go around the other way. What are you working on? Where can they find you online?
I'm actually working on a novel that I started to write probably about 20 years ago that I discovered thanks to the fact that I was sitting around being unable to leave the house for a while. So I started to found it and I said, this is pretty good, sort of. And it's actually something that I wrote on the place. I invented this character that was basically a combination of myself and a friend of mine who worked for the Liverpool Leader. Journalists. And I wrote a whole lot of short stories doing, and they're sort of tongue-in-cheek and funny, and the guys did, you know. And anyway, I wrote this novel as well about it. And as I've gone back through it, it's not in Wollongong, but I made up another town so that I can consult me the book. But most of the stuff that happened to this guy seems extreme, but it's just something based on something that I experienced while being a journalist, which is a really interesting thing to do.
Cool. Well, that sounds good. Sounds good.
God knows if I'll ever publish it. I had to, when I came back to it, I realised I had to put it in the 80s. It doesn't work in the modern day.
I remember talking to you about this before. Yeah. Now I know which one you're talking about. Yeah, okay, cool. Persevere. Of course they'll publish it. It's by Robert.
What was the other bit of the question you asked?
Where can people find you online? Where's the best place? You got your website?
roberthood.com.
There you go. Easy. What about you, Aaron? Where are you at?
I am in the final stages of putting together my first collection of short stories, and it is called Cut to Care, a collection of little hurts. And it's a bit of a change for me. It's kind of a move away from the extreme stuff that I've done in the past, and I touch on everything from thrillers to speculative fiction through to supernatural stuff, quiet horror. It runs a whole gamut, and it's all about the cost and dangers and benefits and beauty and horror of caring for people. And so my background is a social worker, so it's probably therapy on the page. And I'm just kind of putting the finishing touches on it. I'm incredibly proud of it, and I cannot wait for people to read it. And so fingers crossed that continues down the path that it's going, and it's also being developed as a television series at the same time, which is amazing.
Cool.
So we'll see how that happens, and we'll see what happens there. And of course, I'm working on a number of novels and things like that, and things are out to submission. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. And if people would like to check out my stuff, check out aarondries.com, or just, Google me, check me out on Amazon. I've got an author page there, or wherever you get your books, just search for my name. And also interact with me, reach out, let's have a chat. I love talking books, movies, media, art, the whole thing. Best way to do so is through Twitter, at aarondries. And I really wanted to thank you for inviting us here today. This has been terrific fun.
No worries. I'm always happy to hang out with you guys. All right, Joseph, what do you got?
Well, what am I working on at the moment? I am racing towards the finish of a novel that I've been working on for a while, but have I don't want to go into the nitty. I've been through so many first drafts of this novel. It's not funny, but this is the first draft that's finally stuck, and I'm kind of hurtling towards the end. It's very Australian, set kind of half in Canberra, half in sort of south coast New South Wales, and it's a kind of disaster beach holiday. Classic Australian beach holiday meets Lord of the Flies, where a kind of young sociopath comes into her full power. So.
Ooh. Okay, I'm already invested in that. Okay. And where will people find you online to find out more about your stuff?
Oh, yeah, that was the other half of the question. So you can find me and my stuff at spooktapes.net. And if you want to connect with me, at spooktapes on Twitter is the best way to get in touch.
Awesome. So for me, I'm currently working on, just at the end now of a collection of novellas. It's like a mosaic novel. It's 5 interconnected novellas, all set in a fictional, isolated harbour-side Australian town called Gulpepper, but everybody calls it the Gulp because it has a habit of swallowing people. And it's sort of pulp horror, cosmic horror. It's this weird, creepy kind of vibe. I just really drawing. I mean, I live in a not exactly isolated, but I live in a rural harbour town, and so I draw on a lot of that. But I just mix in as much of the weird stuff as I can that I love about Australian country towns and everything, and very strange population involved, and horrible things happen to people, and you really don't want to go to the Gulf. Don't go there. But read about it in January when the book comes out. So that's what I'm working on. And you can find me at alanbaxter.com.au. That's the easiest way to track me down. And I'm on Twitter at Alan Baxter as well. And I spend way too much time on Twitter. So yes, do come and chat to me there and stop me working. I'm game for that. So I think we're about out of time. So Joseph Ashley-Smith, Aaron Dries, Robert Hood, I'm Alan Baxter. Thanks very much for listening. If you have listened to us dribble on for an hour, and we hope you'll check out everything else that's going on at Inconceivable. We hope you'll check out our stores and find us online and come and talk to us about stuff, and talk to us about Oz horror as well, because that's our bag. That's what we're into. So thank you guys. Thanks so much. And I guess the rest of the con continues. I'm Alan Baxter, and welcome to the Aussie Horror Author Show. What is it called? What is it called?
The Author Horror Show.
Aussie Author Horror Show?
Yeah, it's already a horror show.
Sorry, Traci, in advance. You just have to cut off the front. After this, we're going to be pros.
Inconceivable!